While we hope there would be more people here, honestly, thank you so much for showing up. Part of what we did, and it's interesting because as I go around, I interact with a lot of people. And this past weekend, I ran into two people asking me about this meeting. One of them said to me, Dr. Micah, you must be doing a bond. And I said, no. Well, then why are you talking about finance? I said, because we're about to enter our budget. And what we're trying to do is make sure that our community has an opportunity to learn about it. But I said, what this is also linked to is our district scorecard. So if you just don't mind going to the next one. Nope, the other way, Susie. There you go. So back last year, our Board of Trustees adopted a balanced district scorecard. And it was really focused on 4 priorities: students, staff, stakeholders, and stewardship. Tonight, what we're going to do is really focus in on stewardship. And as you can see here, it's right to 3.3b, where we agreed to hold community meetings about different topics. That's really what we're here, is just to show you some things about school finance maybe you do not know or are not totally aware of. But since it's a smaller group, please know that we really want to make this about you also. I'm going to introduce Susie Lackhorn, who's our Executive Director of Budget and Finance. She's going to go through a presentation, but then just understand we're going to sit here and try to answer your questions and deliver on things that you may, are in your hand. All right? So with that, Susie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Micah. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for braving the possibility of rain and skipping out on your opportunity to go to Fiesta to join us tonight. We appreciate it. Tonight, just if you have any questions, there are cards that you can fill out, but otherwise we can answer questions at the end with or without cards. So feel free to write them down on the cards provided, and we have some volunteers who can come pick them up if you want to, okay? All right, so tonight we're going to talk about where the money comes from for school districts, and a little bit about how it's spent. We're going to talk about how school districts are funded. And our primary funding sources are property taxes and state aid. And we're going to talk about also how those two relate to each other, because they have an interesting relationship. One of the biggest things funding school districts is obviously property taxes. So let's take a look at how that property tax process works. This is the beginning of the property tax timeline. During the months of January through April, appraisal districts appraise properties and process exemptions. Then during April and May, they notify property owners of their appraisal values. I don't know about you, but I've already gotten mine. I've got a little envelope sitting at home on my counter, and I'll be honest, I've been too chicken to open it, so it's still sitting there in the envelope with me walking past it going, I don't see you. So last year, you may have noticed in your home values, we had unprecedented growth in our area. Home values shot through the roof as sellers were finding that they were getting multiple bidders, cash offers for their homes. And so there was a lot of competition in the market for homes, and that drove the value of all of our homes up. So as many people got gun shy last year about those values, I've been ignoring mine. But after the notices go out, the Appraisal Review Board will review any protests from property owners. And I'll talk about that process in a little while. And what happens, let's talk about what happens in this first step when appraisal districts are evaluating and appraising property. So during these first months, January through April, the Bexar County Appraisal District appraises properties and sets their values. School districts and other taxing entities play no role in the appraisal value process. But appraisal districts are not completely free to set values without any oversight. The Texas Comptroller's Office has a property tax division that validates and reviews appraisal values every 2 years throughout the state. Now, not everyone pays taxes on their full appraisal value. Several things can be done to reduce your home value for the property taxes that you pay. During this same January through April timeframe, the appraisal district will process exemptions and other things that discount the value of a home. There's also a limit on how much value can grow. So each year, an individual property home can only grow by 10%. So even though the appraisal may grow by more than 10%, the value of the taxes can't grow by more than that. The value that's taxed can't grow by more than 10%, so it's capped. There are a lot of useful resources on the Bexar County Appraisal District's website. It's www.bcad, BexarCountyAppraisalDistrict.org. And one of those resources is a list of exemptions. There's a long list of possible exemptions that can be used to discount the value of a home in order to create the taxable value that you pay your taxes on. And one of the most commonly known exemptions is the homestead exemption. So homeowners who claim a primary residence can get up to $40,000 off of their property value for their taxes. Homeowners who are over 65 also have exemptions and ceilings. Oftentimes we refer to their taxes as being frozen. One of the newer exemptions is for disabled veterans. And there are also lots of other ones. This print screen from the Bexar County Appraisal District website just shows the first few, but there's actually a couple of pages worth. Every so often, people find out that I work in school district business, and so they'll want to talk about their property taxes. And I'm always kind of surprised because I run across people fairly frequently who don't know about exemptions and haven't filed an application to get one. So I strongly encourage you, your friends and your families to go out to the Bexar County Appraisal District website and review the list of exemptions. It starts out by asking who qualifies for this exemption and what benefits does it provide. And the website will also cover how to apply for those exemptions. So those applications, again, are processed by the appraisal district January through April. So let's move along to the timeline. You've gotten your, we're currently in that April to May timeframe when you're receiving your notice of your value. This is also when you can file a protest. This would then be reviewed in May, June, and July. So just like with exemptions, I run across a lot of people who don't necessarily realize that they can file a protest on the value that the appraisal district set. So if you receive your notice that tells you what their appraisal value is and you feel that that's not accurate, you can file a protest. To file a protest, the form is actually included in your notice of appraisal value that's going out right now. If not, if you're like me and you don't like paper floating around the house and you threw it away on accident, the form is available on Bexar County Appraisal District's website. It's on their forms page. So the deadline for filing a protest should be printed on that notice, but typically you have until May 15th or 30 days after you received your appraisal values to file your protest. Once it's filed, the appraisal district will then schedule a hearing. The hearing will either be with an employee of the appraisal district or the appraisal review board, and that's a group of citizens who are independent and evaluate protests. So the appraisal district will send you a notice once they schedule the hearing. It should be in your mail 15 days before your scheduled hearing. They also have a lot of helpful information on their website. They have a great frequently asked questions page or FAQs. And even though we as a school district do not play any role in the appraisal, exemption, or protest process, we just feel like since we get so many questions from taxpayers that pointing people towards resources and providing the information is helpful. So let's keep moving along to the property tax timeline. We've already talked about what happens through January and through July. This is when they're setting those values. Once we get to August and September, taxing units adopt tax rates. So this is when communications between the appraisal district and the taxpayer change over from the appraisal district to the tax assessor collector. So these are two different entities. The appraisal district is responsible for setting property values, and the tax assessor collector is responsible for sending out tax bills and collecting payments. So the tax assessor collector takes the values from the appraisal district and uses them to calculate and collect taxes. They'll send out their bills at the beginning of October, and then payment is due by January 31st, a full year after we started the whole process. Now let's take a look at how school districts set their tax rates. Before school districts can even begin to set their tax rates, they must submit that appraisal value information they received from the appraisal district to the Texas Education Agency. We call them TEA for short. Back in 2019, the state of Texas passed a law requiring districts to lower tax rates to provide property tax relief to our homeowners. This law requires that school district tax revenues be capped at 2.5% growth each year. Now, this doesn't mean that your individual property will only grow by 2.5%. Many properties will still see 10% plus growth. This just means that the tax revenues collected by a school district cannot exceed 2.5%. And if it does, then the school district has to lower their tax rate to bring it in line with that percentage. So school districts send their appraisal value information to the Texas Education Agency, and then they review it, and then they'll send each school district a maximum compressed tax rate, which is basically the base tax rate a school district can approve. So there are two components of the tax rate you see on your bill. The first component is the M&O, Maintenance and Operations Tax Rate. This rate is calculated by taking that base rate TEA created, or told us to use, and adding any enrichment pennies that the district has adopted. I'll talk a little bit more about enrichment pennies in a little while, but this portion of the tax rate is used for the day-to-day operations of the school district. There's another portion of the tax rate that is for our debt service, interest, and sinking. So we pay interest and principal for any bonds issued with this tax rate, and that's the only thing this tax rate can be used for. So when a school district has a bond election and voters approve all these projects for school districts to do, they issue bonds to pay for those projects. And through this portion of the tax rate, they collect revenue to pay back the principal and interest of those bonds. But today we're really going to focus on that maintenance and operations side of the taxes. So on your tax bill, you're only going to see the 1.1822. But keep in mind, it's made up of these two separate components. And just informational purposes, we are the 6th lowest tax rate for all the districts in Bexar County. We're 6.8 cents lower than the average Bexar County school districts. So how does that translate to a homeowner? As we talked before, there are many exemptions that can take the total appraised value down to a taxable value. This taxable value is net of the exemptions and the frozen values and the veterans disability, etc. Last year, our average Northeast homeowner had a taxable value of $256,000. To calculate the taxes owed for Northeast, you divide by 100 and then just simply multiply by our tax rate. So the average homeowner last year for Northeast owed just over $3,000. And just as a side note, of our 119,000 homes, about 35,000 of them have their taxes frozen. All right, so now we've walked through the appraisal process, exemptions and protests, and we talked about how school districts adopt their tax rates. Now, let's talk about state funding and how those property taxes interact with it. Our current year's budget was adopted with an estimated, with over 80% of our revenue coming from property taxes. The next largest piece of our revenue comes from state aid, the state foundation school program. The state also provides funds for teacher retirement, and that is marked on our slide as TRS on behalf payments. So these are the payments the state makes to match teachers for their retirement. So how does that 80% and the 10% from the state work together? Well, before we can talk about that, first we have to understand how the state calculates our funding. So, state funding is made up of two big pieces with lots and lots of moving parts. The first piece is Tier 1, the second piece is Tier 2. We call this section the enrichment piece. So the first one, Tier 1, covers allotments and the basic components of our funding, and it's also the largest piece of our funding formula. So what makes up Tier 1? Tier 1 is primarily based on student attendance and demographics. The state sets a base amount of funding per student, and then they also recognize that certain students in certain settings require additional funds, and therefore they get additional funding. Like I said, funding formulas are primarily based on average daily attendance. So when students aren't in school, districts don't get funded for it then. If a student came to school every day of the school year, we would be funded $6,160 for that particular student. This $6,160 is set in state law and can only be changed by the state legislature. Since funding is based so heavily on attendance, it's interesting to note that COVID has had a real impact on our attendance rate. Prior to COVID, our attendance rate ran between 95 and 96%. For the current year, we're averaging about 93.5%. So for each change in 1% of attendance, that equates to about $4 million less in revenue for the district. So you can see that attendance is a very important piece of our funding model and can have a significant impact on the district operations. So, in addition to that 6160, some students will drive additional funding because of those instructional settings. Examples would include special education, dyslexia, career and tech, bilingual students. This is not a complete list, but it's a good sample to explain the types of logic behind the funding formula. So once you add all of our factors together, you get the total for our Tier 1 funding allotment. Now, Tier 2 funding is very different, but it's similar in the way that it has lots of moving parts and is pretty complex. This portion is really more of an option to enrich a district's operations, and it focuses on the additional pennies added to your base tax rate that TEA mandated. Basically, the state takes your average daily attendance and adds weights for those students in those special settings like special ed. Then they multiply it by a guaranteed yield and the number of pennies above the base rate that were adopted in the tax rate. The guaranteed yield is equal to about 96%, the district in the 96th percentile as the wealthiest in the state, what they would collect in tax revenue. So the state basically provides additional funds needed to fund the school district at the same level as that 96th wealthiest district. The number of pennies eligible for this matching at the 96th percentile is 8. Districts have had the opportunity to get 5 additional pennies without going out for an election. These 8 pennies have a guaranteed yield, but districts can go all the way up to 17 pennies. And they provide additional funding, but not at the same level as that 96th percentile. So you can see a wide range of additional pennies across the state of Texas. Northeast has 5 additional pennies, and this is the max that any district can have at the current time without going to voters for approval. All right, so now I've made your brains tired talking about tiers and pennies. Let's talk about how property taxes and these funding formulas interact. All right, so now I'm going to move over here and do a little demonstration. Let's pretend like this cup represents our total funding calculated by the state. Every district would have a slightly different size cup because it's based off of attendance and enrollment and how many students are in all those different instructional settings. But every district has the same formula, so the math behind the cup is the same. So the state goes through and calculates how much funding a district is allotted. Then what happens? Now they have to determine where the actual money comes from. So the first thing that always goes into the cup, filling the funding, is property taxes. So we're going to pretend now that the cup is our total funding allowed, and the red is property taxes. Property taxes always fills the cup first. So for a district that doesn't have a very big property tax base, they won't collect a whole lot. Their property taxes will fill their funding formula at a lower level, less than half. The state says, oh, you didn't get enough money from property taxes, so we will make the difference to get you to your allotment. So now you're fully funded, and you've got a really cool looking drink. For a district like Northeast, who has a pretty sizable property base, I said earlier that over 80% of our revenue comes from property taxes. So our cup looks more like that, where property taxes make up the bulk of our funding. And then the state comes in and finishes us off. There's a third situation. What happens for those districts whose property taxes are bigger than their cup? So they're going to fill their cup, and the state's going to be like, okay, you've got plenty of money, and it never works out perfectly, so eventually it's going to overflow because they collected more than what the state determined their funding should be. What do you think happens with this leftover property tax collections that district collected? Any guesses? Any brave souls out there? The state takes it. So the district has to send it back to the state. This is called recapture. And it's based off an older model called Robin Hood. So you may have heard it called Robin Hood because the goal was to take from wealthier districts and give it to poorer districts. But what happens is the state is allowed to use it to fulfill their other obligations. One interesting thing to note here is that when you go from year to year, and I end up pouring more red into the cup than I did the year before, what happens with that extra money that Northeast got? Because you wrote a check, right, to the tax collector, assessor collector, I'm sorry. So you wrote a check that said for Northeast taxes, and it was bigger than last year. Does Northeast really get that extra money? No. What happens is the state just gives us less of theirs. So we only get what's in our cup. We don't get to keep that extra increase that you see in your tax bill. All right, so I'll make my way back over here without tripping and falling. All right, so just a couple of reminders from that demonstration. The state sets the size of the cup, right? So through the legislature, they set the 6160 and the funding formulas that drive how much funding the district's allowed to have. And then taxes always go first. And if your tax revenue is more than what your funding is allowed, that's called recapture. And when your property tax collections go up, the state then gets to contribute less. This is a historical bar chart that reflects the percentage of property taxes versus the state and our other funding pieces. And as you can see, I know it's a little hard to read, but for 22-23, we're at 81% property taxes and 10% state. If you look at the size of that yellow piece, it's just been consistently growing year after year. There was one year in 2019 where this dipped, and that's when the state passed some property tax relief. And so then they ended up contributing more to try and help property tax payers. But the system is set up that every time property values grow like they've been growing, it provides relief to the state and their contribution to school districts. So then your property taxpayers are funding a bigger percentage, as you can see, and the state contributes less. So we've talked about where the money comes from. Now we want to take a quick look at where does our money go? When we look at Northeast General Fund or Maintenance and Operations budgeted expenditures, nearly 86% of what we spend goes to salaries and benefits. We are a labor-intensive system. This creates some special challenges. When you talk about revenue, I talked about how our revenue level is set at $61.60 per student. And this remains flat until the legislature does something to change it. Well, it's been at this level since 2019. The legislature meets every 2 years, and in 2021, they chose not to make any changes. When you have a flat level of revenue, it makes it very difficult to find additional funds to cover rising costs. It forces you to do your only other option at that time is to cut costs. But then that becomes a challenge when you're so labor intensive that 86% of your budget is in salaries and benefits. Since 2019, we've seen inflation of approximately 15%. So when our utility bills go up $500,000 like they did with this most recent price increase, we don't have an easily accessible way to generate additional revenue to offset that cost. Let's take another look at our expenditures. The Texas Education Agency requires us to record our transactions by functional category. And this chart shows the primary groups of those functional categories. Instruction and instruction-related are things that are directly related to the classroom, like teacher salaries, instructional materials, the training for the teachers. School leadership and instructional and school leadership think about things like campus principals and assistant principals, and then curriculum support staff in central office. Student support services include things like counseling, nursing, transportation. Administration would be a lot of central office departments, human resources, payroll, accounting. Non-student support would include things like maintenance, custodial, security. Northeast has a police department, and data processing. So as you can see, we spend 65% of our expenditures on instruction and instruction-related costs. We feel that it's important that our biggest spending be in this category, as this has the most direct impact on our students. And TEA reviews how much we spend on administrative costs each year and rates us on that. Let's take a look at how that works. So, Every school district gets a rating on FIRST. That's the state's school financial accountability rating system. Within this system, districts are rated on an administrative cost ratio. The formula shown here is your instructional leadership costs plus general administration costs divided by the sum of our instructional and counseling costs. So if your ratio is below 8.55% for districts of our size, you receive the maximum number of points. So a lower percentage is better because you're comparing how much you spend on administration to how much you spend in the classroom. So in 2022, our ratio was about 5.6%, and it was the lowest in Bexar County. We consistently place in the lowest 2 districts for Bexar County. So, in summary, if we can get the sound to work, I feel like I'm echoing a little bit because we don't have enough bodies filling the chairs. We're going to try to play a video that, I think I have it queued up, Jason, that talks about where we spend our money, and it goes through the more detailed functional categories that I was just talking about.
Time to wake up. It's another glorious morning in the Northeast Independent School District. You are one of nearly 59,000 students in the district ready to kick off a new school day filled with imagination and discovery. First things first, let's jump on that six-wheeler that delivers the future each and every school day. You are among the 33,235 qualifying students riding 242 bus routes, traveling nearly 17,000 miles within the district's 144 square miles. That's the equivalent of traveling to Bangladesh and back in one day. You could even travel 2.5 times around the Earth's moon in that many miles. The Transportation Department accomplishes this with only 3 cents of every dollar. This is where your dollar is spent. The positive energy at your school is already tipping the scales as you arrive ready to start the day. You arrive at school that is clean and well maintained before, during, and after school hours. You may even wonder just how much goes towards cleaning buildings. 30 cents? 20 cents? How about 8 cents of each dollar? How about electricity and other utilities? Just 3 cents out of each dollar pays for heating and cooling systems, making sure that electricity flows through your school. This is where your dollar is spent. Best place to learn is a healthy and safe environment. 2 cents from your dollar keeps students healthy and safe with nurses at every campus and security. Now it's time to walk into class. With more than 70% of teachers with 5 or more years of experience, NEISD's highly qualified educators are brought on board to shape young minds for 57 cents out of each dollar. For 6 cents, you will benefit from instructional aids and instructional supplies. 4 cents on top of that is dedicated to training teachers to ensure that our educators follow the state-approved educational curriculum. This is where your dollar is spent. It's not easy to learn on an empty stomach, so let's head to the cafeteria where school nutrition service staff work diligently to prepare a nutritional, well-balanced meal that will get you through the rest of your day. Each day, approximately 13,173 breakfasts, 37,217 lunches, and 1,888 after-school snacks are served. Think about it. All that preparation, time, and staff, yet NEISD manages to do it for only $2.26 for each breakfast, $4.33 for each lunch, and $4.03 for each snack. The NEISD School Nutrition Department is self-supporting and does not get any funding from the district budget. In fact, the School Nutrition Department reimburses the district annually for services such as human resources, payroll, administration, and etc. Frederick Douglass once said, "Once you learn to read, you'll be free forever." With this idea in mind, NEISD libraries feature books professionally selected by qualified librarians that make it their mission to give all students equitable access to print and digital publications. With more than 766,000 print books in circulation and 23,870 electronic books available to students, the district makes all this possible for 2 cents from each dollar. This is where your dollar is spent. Looking for a clearer path to success? With 4 pennies out of every dollar, students at every grade level have the benefit of school counselors, who, at the high school level, counsel students on the process of applying to and paying for college, as well as provide info regarding scholarships, student loans, and preparation tactics for the SAT, and what courses are required to prepare for post-graduation education or employment. This is where your dollar is spent. Teachers can't teach without the proper framework of support staff and administration. 6 cents of every dollar go towards staffing at each campus, with each group getting distinct instructional tones and an educational culture for that school. And how about the staff at Broadway and Tesoro? This 6-story building houses departments that serve as key facets to the district. It is here that 3 cents out of every dollar provides health insurance options for all employees, preparation of payroll checks, purchasing for supplies and equipment, and directives assuring that numerous federal and state regulations are followed. These are just a few of the many services provided at Central Office. This is where your dollar is spent. So you've enjoyed a bus ride to your clean and well-maintained school, where a multitude of staff members make it their priority to help you find your individual path to success. The last bell has sounded off, and now it's time to ride the school bus back home. Unless you are one of the thousands of students who take part in extracurricular activities for 2 cents out of every dollar. This is where your dollar is spent. From transportation, clean and comfortable schools, meals, extracurricular activities, qualified teachers, and everything you see on this list, a few pennies out of every dollar funds the functions that prepare students for a premier education in a school district where in 2022, a total of 4,480 seniors crossed the stage. All NEISD graduates follow the Foundation High School program. Come and discover NEISD. This is where your dollar is spent.
I know that might have been hard to hear or see all the way through, but that video is available on our website. You can just Google Northeast ISD, how the dollar spends the day. It's out there. So take a look at it from home when you can hear it well and see it well and pause it and rewind. All right, so if you have any questions, we'd be happy to try to answer them or add them to our FAQ.
I'm going to give you two. I mean, there's not a whole. If you'll write it down, just so that I can say it out and record it, and just so we got a question submitted earlier from online, and it says, "Who assigns or authorizes budget for school safety and security? If I have a proposal regarding school security that includes cost-related expenses, where would I address it?" So who assigns and authorizes the budget is really the Board of Trustees. So what we do when it comes to the budget is I bring recommendations as the superintendent in conjunction with the budget folks, and we bring it to the Board of Trustees for approval. I think that's one of the things that I think some folks don't understand is that I don't have unilateral authority to just make changes. I have to go to our board for permission to do that. So where would I bring them? I would suggest that they send them to myself or to our Senior Director of Security and Safety, who we hired this past fall. Another question we had submitted online. I'm stalling, trying to give you some time to write, okay? Take your time. When a school loses funding, where does that money go if the taxpayers are still having to pay? Is it allocated to another school? You want to take that one, Susan?
So the state basically gets it back into their budget, and so it doesn't necessarily get allocated to a particular school. They can use it for helping fund other schools, meeting their obligation to keep schools funded, or for something else. There's not really a requirement. Don't make him nervous.
So, okay, you ready for this question? If salary and benefits is the main focus on expenses of our property taxes, which would indicate the best teachers, why is, I'm not going to use that, but another district the number one in quality and SA surrounding area yet, San Antonio surrounding area yet property tax is so much less? Sure. So, I guess my question to you would be, who has designated it the number one district? Sure. So, and I think that's an often a common question I'm asked. Every site that does it, like Niche or Great Schools or so forth, all have different formulas for calculating what it is or how they come up with the rating system. Most of that, and it just depends on which site, is dependent on star data. It's a lot of accountability data and things like that. Like I could say, according to the Reader's Choice Award in San Antonio, we were the rated #1 district in San Antonio. So there's a lot of competing things out there, and I think oftentimes that lends to some confusion with parents and community about, so how do I know which one is really the best? Again, that's why what I often encourage parents to do is go tour schools and go ask questions, because I think until you walk in and feel a campus and understand it, I don't think those rating systems always tell the whole story. Does that make sense?
For the rating, it does.
Yeah.
But even going back to the property taxes, if they're still having very good teachers,
Sure.
good districts.
They're similar. Their pay is the percentages across districts are pretty standard. That it doesn't. We're not that much more or less than they are. It's just pretty much the standard. So most districts are somewhere in the 85% in their teacher pay. Or salaries are making it up. But understand that's not just teacher pay, that's all employees pay. That's custodial, bus drivers, school nutrition, all of those things. It's not just a teacher's salary. And so when you look at, so I'll expand on that a little bit. Susie, if you want to jump in, you're welcome. But when we talk about pay, a lot of times people look at salary. What we do as a school district is we come with a total compensation package. So, for instance, and I know we don't have it, but what we like to show our teachers, I've shown it several times at convocation. So that's when we bring all the teachers from each cluster together at a high school and we talk to them, or I speak to them at the beginning of the year. And what we demonstrate to them is really the benefits package that we have in Northeast ISD for our employees. So I can tell you, I used to work in another district. When I moved to Northeast, I didn't get a pay raise, but I did when it came to benefits. I got $500 more a month because our benefits are so much lower. So I know the district that you are, and the only reason I'm not saying it, it's not that I'm afraid of it, I don't like to talk about other school districts in any which way. I don't find there any benefit in it. I can tell you that their benefits package is nowhere near what ours are. And so for any employee that's coming and looking for those, like for instance, we offer a 90-10 plan still. Most school districts, I don't think there's really any left that offer a 90-10. The other great thing that we've been able to do with benefits is we've been able to not change providers a lot. Again, working in another school district, every 2 years I had to change providers. That doesn't sound like a big deal until my doctor is in network and then 2 years later they're out of network. And then I'm coming in and paying out of network expenses that I didn't know. One of the stories that I love is actually from one of our teachers here who had cancer. And what she did is approached me and spoke to me about what that meant. So she was sitting in a treatment center and she was sitting beside another teacher from another district. And what they were talking about is the level of care that they were provided. And so at that point, what she described to me is there were 3 levels of care that that she qualified for, or that each one of them could have chosen. She said, for Northeast, when she's still a teacher here, she said, I could choose all 3. The other teacher had the choice of 1 because that healthcare plan just wasn't as robust as one of the ones or ours that we have. So you look at pay, and again, I can tell you a district to the south does Social Security. And what happens is a lot of them go in and actually make less money, even though the salary is more. So salary isn't just the one piece to it, it's everything. Do you have a question? Sure. There's a few? Okay. Is the $6,000 per student the size of the cup in the demonstration or the amount of blue liquid?
So the 6,000 is the main driver in building the cup. The blue liquid is the state contributing to that total. And so they don't contribute the full 6,000 because your property taxes are paying for most of it.
I'm just going to keep reading, okay? Does the size of the cup differ by the district?
So technically it does, because we have 59,000 students attending at 93.5%. There are districts with 1,000 students. So technically their cup would be smaller because they're allotted less funds. But the cup is still based off of the same formulas, the same 6160. And the property taxes always go in first. It's the same formula for everybody. It's going to vary based off of your size.
And I'm going to get to your questions too, sir, okay? How do students moving to charter schools affect funding?
Oh, we could be here a whole nother night
But
talking about it.
But what we'll do is just broaden it out. Anytime, just as she explained, the only way to increase that cup is to either gain more students or have better attendance rate. So whether they're moving to a charter or moving to another school district, it's constantly the ebbs and flows of it. Does that make sense?
I'll say one quick thing. So the size of the cup, the main driver is that 6160, right? And so if that student goes to a charter, then we don't get that 6160 for that student. The challenges districts face with students moving to charters is that you lose them all over the district. And for our earlier grades, we're required to staff at a certain level. And so you may lose students, but you may not be able to reduce staff to offset that. You instantly think, well, if you have less students, then you need less teachers. But that doesn't always work out perfectly. And what we tend to have seen in the past is that we aren't able to reduce teachers because we're required to have certain funding or staffing formulas. So, that's the charter problem in a nutshell.
And then I'm going to give you your last question, right? How would vouchers affect a property tax and state pieces of funding? You want me to? Sure. I think that's some of the burning question right now, because as we just described, or as Susie just described, we're getting 6160. The proposed bill is giving a parent 8,000. And so the question becomes, where does that 8,000 come from, right? I think that's the burning question everybody has. It has to come from property tax. I mean, that's where it's going to come from. All right. So what determines whether a school budgets for a family specialist? So family specialists, I'm going to try to do my best, but chime in, Susie, all right? So I know that's something that some folks have asked a question about. So while Susie talked to you about finance at a very high level, we're going to have to get down in the weeds of finance just a little bit. There are different pots of money within that budget. One of them is called state compensatory ed money, or what we refer to as SCE money. What happened this year is the Texas Education Agency changed what those monies can be used on. And so as a result, we had to look around and say, this bucket of money, are we allowed to continue to fund it in these positions in this manner? At some campuses, the answer is yes. At some campuses, the answer is no. That is based on what's called title status. So the number of free and reduced students, or free and reduced lunch students, or low socioeconomic students at that campus. So that threshold is what sets whether we're allowed to spend that money in that manner. Does that make sense?
Makes sense.
And that's what it is. We're constantly, in fact, I often speak with our legal counsel, because as we well know, we're in the biennium and the state right now is in session. Every time the state is in session, We have a legal book. Every year we get, or every biennium we get a new one. And he said he's been in doing school law for over 20 years. He said it used to be about this thick. It's almost tripled in size. Because while you think and what you hear are laws really about public education, there's a lot of other laws that are passing that are having an impact on us as well. Not just directly to education, but anything with property tax, different things. All right?
Yeah, so when we were talking about these extra funding buckets in our tier 1, I talked about special ed and dyslexia and career and tech bilingual. One of those is you get extra funding for your free and reduced students. And so all of these allotments and have particular things you can spend the money on. And so like for special education, special education teachers and the services that they need. Bilingual has a whole different set of rules, and the compensatory education for those students who are economically disadvantaged who qualify for free and reduced. Those rules have been changing recently, and so that's that whole situation. But each bucket has its own special set of rules on how much you have to spend on what.
And we're not the rule maker. Again, just as sometimes we have to shift priorities just based on what we're seeing in our schools, the state sometimes shifts priorities about what we can and cannot do. And so then we just have to go through it and figure out what makes sense and what doesn't, while always trying to make certain that we're delivering the services that our community and what we believe we need to deliver. Very quiet.
We got one over.
Hey, great. Thanks. Thank you. Since you mentioned teachers' benefits, is it possible for the district to opt into Social Security? Dan has said, I'm looking at my CFO.
In 2005.
Here, come on, you got to use the mic. This is our CFO, our Chief Financial Officer.
In 2005, we had an election for people who were hired before 1986 to get into Medicare Part B. But for Social Security, for us to do it, it had to be 100%. Everybody would have to vote. So we'd have to go to our employees and say, hey, it's got to be 100%. We can't have any negative votes. So yeah, we've never really approached our employees for that. I think San Antonio ISD and maybe a couple of others in the state pay into Social Security. But since we're part of TRS, a lot of the time Social Security, there's a windfall provision. So even if you're paying Social Security, you're not going to get the full pop of Social Security. With TRS, they're going to do a windfall provision because talking to some people in SISD who retired, they were kind of shocked in that. So yes, back in 05 and 08, 11, we talked about it, but we haven't addressed that because we didn't think there was a big push for people that wanted to take another 6% out of their salary for Social Security.
Did that answer your question for you sufficiently? Okay, thank you. All right. Do you have anything to add, Ms. Lackhorn?
Please fill out the survey. Thank you for coming.
Yeah. Look, I appreciate y'all coming. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. If any of you need to hang around afterwards and ask something off to the side, we'll make ourselves available to you to do it. But thank you all for coming and drive safe.